There can come a moment when the life that you're living just no longer feels right. An emptiness creeps in, meaning fades, motivation drains. You begin to question who you are, where you're going, what even really matters anymore. And beneath the surface, something starts to crack. Not because you're broken, but because somewhere along the way, you stop listening to a quiet voice within that was trying to guide you back to truth. And it's in moments like this when our soul is practically begging, crying for attention, when we've abandoned these deeper parts of ourselves for far too long. A lot of people misunderstand an existential crisis because they lack the initiatory context to better navigate this landscape. So I figured it might be helpful to share what it's like to be inside the breakdown, the collapse in the middle of an existential crisis. Because truthfully, I'm not speaking from the other side of the darkness. I'm actually speaking from being in it right now, a crisis of meaning, purpose, identity, direction. And part of why I'm doing this is to try and channel what's raw and real in a way that might actually be useful for myself by mapping the terrain and remembering that there is a way through. And then hopefully for anyone else who finds themselves standing in a similar place. So throughout this episode, we'll explore the hallmarks of an existential crisis, the collapse of the old, the initiatory descent, confronting the wounds that we meet in the underworld, the early beginnings of reorientation and re-emergence, and how to navigate it all with as much awareness and honesty and care as possible. If we're not already connected on social media, you can find me pretty much everywhere at Caiyuda. So let's dive straight in with the following question. What are some of the hallmarks of an existential crisis? Well, if you're anything like me, there might be a moment or two in life when you start to question what all of it really means. You might experience a deep unease in the way that you're starting to perceive or experience life, or an unsettling feeling around a loss of meaning or fulfillment, or a confusion around identity, who you are, direction, where you're going, and purpose. What's it all mean? And why do you actually care? A lot of people are familiar with the midlife crisis, but really, an existential crisis can arrive at different life stages. In our 20s, when future possibilities overwhelm us or we awaken to different layers of reality. In our 30s and 40s, when the life that we've built starts revealing many of its cracks. In our 50s and beyond, as our mortality, our awareness of death becomes more apparent. The thing is, though, these crises don't necessarily follow age. They often arrive during major life transitions or big life experiences. They can be linked to a sense of pressure, stress, death, the collapse of what once felt meaningful, or a changing of what it is that we value, or the dissolution of our perspective of reality. They can be complex. They can involve our emotions, behaviors, relationships, our spirituality. And then, yeah, for some people, there may even be a biological component involving neurotransmitters like low dopamine and serotonin, which can mimic or amplify the sense of existential collapse, existential anxiety, existential depression. But this is where people lack the understanding because, from a different lens, from a mythic lens, it's not just about the symptoms, it's about the story that lives underneath all of that. The truth is, existential crises are initiatory events, deep and challenging collapses and reorganizations of identity, meaning, purpose, direction. They're threshold experiences where the tectonic plates under the psyche start rumbling and shifting, where something about the life that we've been living no longer feels right, and where some version of who we've been has to die so that we can transition into a life that actually feels more truthful and aligned to the version of ourselves that's actually wanting to emerge. These crises are a deeply human phenomena. They can take the form of larger cosmic questioning. Why are we even here? What's the purpose of any of this? What actually is reality? Or they can strike closer to home on the personal level with identity, vocation, direction. And with all of this deep questioning, it's not uncommon for the ground to open up and swallow people into new philosophies, like that of nihilism, meaninglessness, that life doesn't have any inherent meaning. And this is where you might come across the likes of Nietzsche, who, from my understanding, didn't necessarily endorse nihilism as a philosophy to live by and to remain forever stuck in the question of, well, if life has no inherent meaning, then what's the point of anything? But rather, he diagnosed it as a crisis and something that we must overcome and move through. The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus speaks to a core philosophical tension that can emerge in an existential crisis. He defined the absurd as this collision between our fundamental human hunger for meaning and then, on the other hand, the unreasonable silence of the universe in response. And out of that collision arises what he called a truly serious philosophical question. If the universe does not supply inherent meaning, is life even still worth living? In the myth, essentially, Sisyphus angers the gods and they condemn him to the lifelong task of rolling a massive boulder up a mountain, only for it to roll back down again each time it nears the top, over and over again, for all eternity. For Camus, it symbolizes part of the human condition, this endless, futile labor of constantly striving for something in a world that actually provides no inherent meaning. Camus points out that part of the tragedy of Sisyphus is that he's conscious. He's acutely aware of his condition. As he pushes that stone, it's strain, it's sweat, it's effort, until he reaches the top and some sense of purpose is achieved. But then over and over again, he watches the stone tumble back down the mountain, knowing the endless cycle, feeling the futility of this constant labor. And in this story, Camus says that the point that interests him the most is the pause before Sisyphus walks back down the mountain. Because in that pause, when Sisyphus is fully conscious of the cycle, he says that something unexpected becomes possible. That if Sisyphus can accept the absurd without turning to illusion or escape, then even within this eternal, seemingly sorrowful, futile labor, a strange freedom and even a kind of joy might actually be able to arise. Because if sorrow can be present, why not joy? So Camus suggests that even despite the silent response of the universe, life can still be lived with fullness, with depth. Not because meaning is supplied, is given to us, but because we can choose to live wholeheartedly within the tension, with the crisis. And while Camus himself didn't necessarily claim that meaning is born from meaninglessness, we might arrive at that doorway to that deeper insight. That despite the absurd, despite the perspective that life might be inherently meaningless, it's that very space of meaninglessness that can become the birthplace of meaning. An opportunity to discover or create meaning through relationship, through feeling, through experience, through choice. So whether the crisis is cosmic or personal or both, from the level of the soul, this collapse of meaning, it's not pathological. It's this threshold crossing, a developmental gateway. It can be the painful and yet absolutely necessary dismantling of whatever architecture stands in the way of us getting closer to our inner truth. As Carl Jung suggested, the beginning of the death of the false self so that a deeper, more authentic self can begin to emerge. The initiatory descent and the collapse of the old. Existential crises don't necessarily arrive suddenly, nor violently for that matter. From my experience, it's more of a slow dissolution, like an erosion of our familiar markers of purpose, identity, meaning, direction. I mean, yeah, for sure, there could certainly be a rapid destabilization induced by peak experiences or altered states through the likes of psychedelics or sacred medicines that rip the veil from the psyche. But I'm speaking to the other kind, the crisis that seems to bubble away quietly, like it has done for me. Those ones that whisper, something's off, something doesn't feel right. That whisper That's the first stage: recognition, awareness, becoming conscious of it. And the second stage is likely to be the descent. That slow slipping away from a life that once felt stable, steady, reliable, meaningful, but somehow now feels lacking, hollow, outdated, empty, misaligned, not right. And for me, that descent has been happening for a while now. Feels like I've been moving through a pretty big season of drought. Quite honestly, lacking meaning, connection, joy, fulfillment, which has been affecting me in all kinds of ways: emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, relationally, financially. I've been questioning a lot. And once the questions begin, they can start knocking on every single door inside the temple of the psyche. Is this really the life that I want to live? Why do I feel the way that I feel? Why do I feel so torn between pathways and decisions? What do I actually care about? What the hell do I even want anymore? I'm not sure a lot of facilitators speak about this because it certainly isn't glamorous. It doesn't seem enlightened. It doesn't seem inspirational. It can be disorienting. It can feel destabilizing. But then also, there is an invitation to recognize that when approached in the right way with the appropriate context, it's also sacred ground because it marks the doorway to an initiatory threshold. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard articulated something called the dizziness of freedom. It's that moment where you realize that you have a choice not to be bound by the old path, and you recognize the freedom of possibilities before you, but that freedom isn't necessarily experienced as a good thing. It can be overbearing. The responsibility of choice can leave you with an overwhelming feeling of dread. Because whether you choose a new path or remain where you are, the foundations of one's life can crumble away anyway, sometimes and often in deeply painful and disorienting ways. And yet, within a lot of these old philosophies, these thinkers understood that before renewal, there is disorientation. Before clarity, there's unraveling. Before transformation, there's death. Not literal death, which unfortunately some people get confused by, thinking that the best option to escape the pain and that dread and the overwhelm is to commit suicide. And hey, look, I'll admit, I'm not immune from the occasional suicidal ideation when I'm in the throes of the darkness. But what's actually being invited is the death of an identity, the death of a worldview, the death of the version of ourselves trying to keep everything in place. From a shamanic lens, it's dismemberment. And this is the stage where we start to lose grip on the narrative that we've been living. And depending on how tightly we've held onto that narrative, the descent can feel like a lot of things and can come in all manner of waves and phases, like loss of motivation, emotional volatility, feeling shame, guilt, anger, apathy, depression, loneliness, a strange grief for a life that you're still living, feeling empty, numb, wanting to cry, but nothing comes out. Could be a fractured sense of self or a disassociation, or DPDR, which stands for depersonalization or derealization, which is where you feel deeply detached from your sense of self or from your environment. You could experience a kind of deep soul fatigue, or that overwhelming sense of dread that somewhere along the way you've taken a wrong turn. You might be questioning relationships, love, career, purpose, direction, meaning, mission. You might experience the pressure of trying to make some kind of drastic change that you don't actually feel ready to make, or the sense that something inside you is absolutely begging for truth, even if it looks like truth is going to cost you everything. For me, it's felt like a bunch of that, coming and going in waves, like this deep rising of a message that the life that I've been living no longer fits, no longer feels right. And to let you a little bit deeper into my personal world for a moment, while also being mindful of privacy, one of the deepest tensions in my life for almost a decade now has been between the domestic family man and then the ceremonial soul initiation wilderness guide. The two aren't mutually exclusive, not at all. They can actually coexist beautifully together. But the truth is that I have lived inside a conflict where I've never really felt fully able to inhabit either path. Part of me carried what felt like a deeper calling into the shamanic soul initiation arts, while part of me adjusted itself around domestic living, duty, obligation, partnership, family. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger called this, and please excuse my pronunciation, Geworfenheit, or thrownness, being thrown into a world, a structure, a set of roles that we didn't necessarily consciously choose, but we still must learn how to navigate. From the outside, what I have looks like a great life. And yet, over time, through the dynamic of domestic partnership and family in its current form, it feels like I've been slowly dying inside. And of course, that affects everyone. And it's tough to admit that, but I feel that way. And that's because I experience a deep sense of shame and guilt. Like, why can't I just be content with that life? I know that there are a stack of people that would love to have what I have. So there's this clear split between an inner truth and the presentation of my outer life. Like an important part of my soul got buried beneath a big part of my life that I never consciously intended to have. And yeah, tough luck. Life isn't easy. We all have responsibilities and obligations. Sacrifice and trade-offs are always part of life. We don't always get what we want. Life is full of complexity and challenge. But I also know that I'm not alone in being torn between worlds. At what point does sacrifice and compromise become self-abandonment? At what point do we realize the trade-off is costing us our vitality, our connection to soul? Some of the truths that I suppressed, the whispers that I pushed to the side to maintain a sense of stability, steadiness, and belonging, they've now become impossible to ignore. And in awakening to this, and also in the dissolution, the vision and the mission and the purpose, that North Star that once guided me and even nourished me, has definitely faded, dissipated, slipped away. In some ways, it's felt like regression rather than an evolution. And it's painful and confusing to acknowledge that there's a message that something within the dynamic of my private life in its current form has to die in a big way, and that there's a calling coming from outside that. I don't really know what that calling is, but I am painfully aware that it is indeed there. And that not knowing can create its own kind of tension, and we have to sit with that. My head argues for nobility, duty, responsibility, sacrifice, obligation, selflessness, doing the morally right thing, keeping things together. The heart feels love and compassion and care and pain and grief. And then the soul calls for fullness, for aliveness, for initiation, death, rebirth, expansion. So if you're in this place, or you have been, I get it. It can feel complex, heavy, agonizing, full of that dread in being presented choices but not being able to choose. The thing is though, awakening to the depth of our own self-abandonment makes one thing unavoidable. Something big has to change. Personally, I've had to summon some really big courage to have some painfully uncomfortable conversations. And what the future holds is a big unknown. It typically is, but it feels like an even bigger unknown than usual. Like I said, I'm reporting from the thick of the crisis, so it is hard to know a lot. But there is one thing that I do know, And it's that this is where people often mistake the crisis for being a problem to try and avoid. Confronting the wounds in the underworld. People think that the descent or the collapse is a problem that needs to be held at bay or prevented at all costs, kind of like a glitch in the matrix or a bug in the system, and that any sense of deep disorientation or discombobulation or being lost or confused or torn means that there is something fundamentally wrong with them. And yeah, truthfully, I've felt like that at times too. Like I've failed, like I'm broken, like I've fucked up, like I am fucked up. But then also I know that that's just the mind being an overly harsh critic. And I know that there are much deeper truths, that often it's the psyche trying to shed an outdated identity. And the descent is part of the process. The collapse is part of the initiation. The disorientation is what the psyche does when there's a reorganization that's desperately needed. The psychoanalyst James Hollis writes that midlife crisis, and really any kind of major threshold crossing, asks us to step out of the old map, the map that was drawn by who we were, not who it is that we're becoming. And when the old map starts to dissolve, yeah, the mind can panic. It scrambles for familiar ground to latch onto. But the dissolution is necessary. The surrender into that is necessary, lest we cause ourselves even more stress and even more tension, just fighting to grasp onto something that's already on its way out. Viktor Frankl, the author of Man's Search for Meaning, highlighted that the meaning that we've been living is often not the meaning that we need. Sometimes meaning collapses if it is inherited, outdated, socially conditioned, no longer true. Maybe it's because we have ignored or suppressed a deeper meaning or a deeper calling for far too long that can no longer be squashed. And so the descent can begin, not as a punishment, but as a form of liberation from what's no longer working, from what's no longer true. So the descent is not the end of the process, not at all. It's part of the threshold initiation. And when we're here, we might feel like we're without anchor, we're emptied out, we're undefined. The necessary dismantling of illusions or the psychic dismemberment before the reassembly. As I mentioned earlier, it can feel like a regression, like we're going backwards, but it's actually the doorway to what comes next. And part of that may well be the visitation to the underworld and going through our necessary ordeal. It's here that we face harsh truths. We get honest with our pain, with what hurts, with what we have avoided. Grief, fear, rage, abandonment, shame, guilt, betrayal, our longings, our unmet needs, our unrealized dreams or our suppressed desires, the truth of incompatibilities and misalignments. We come to terms with and accept that change is here. Life will be different. We don't shy away from the darkness. We stop running from our crisis. We stop running from our wounds. And that's important because our wounds aren't just the places where we feel pain, they're actually sites of great potential and power. As Carl Jung said, our genius hides behind our wounds. Not our genius as in how we refer to it today as being high IQ or superior intellect or brilliance, but genius referring to our guiding intelligence, our unique and original blueprint within, our inner spirit, this kind of soul compass. The Greeks called it our daemon, the whisperer of one's inner truth, a force guiding us toward our greater potential, our inner companion, whose task it is to better steer us toward the life that we're meant to live. And that's obviously something that I'm trying to re-listen to because I've spent the past decade along the ceremonial initiation, wilderness immersion, sacred medicine path. That's been my role. It hasn't been easy, but I also recognize that it has been linked to my gifts that I have to offer others. And yet, as part of the dissolution, I've also been questioning whether I want to be defined by that. So, in the midst of any crisis of meaning, purpose, identity, we need to do our best to listen to our daemon, our genius, our inner guidance, to see what the calling is, where the calling is, what direction we're being pulled. Because one thing is for sure, if we don't face our crisis and create space for our daemon to speak, we risk further fragmentation, disassociation, depression, debilitation. And instead of making contact with our daemon, we risk moving closer to our demons. So, confronting the wounds are imperative. It could well be the necessary place for false identities to crack, for the persona not aligned to truth to break. And when we break down, our daemon, our genius, has a better chance to break through. And that fracture of the wound is where a deeper truth can finally start to leak through. Now, sitting and being with our wounds is not meant to be some kind of self-deprecation, self-flagellation process where we're punishing ourselves, precisely because it is a doorway to our genius. And not only that, if we look closely enough, the wound always points toward a gift. And I don't mean that metaphorically, I mean that literally. For example, the child who felt unseen can become the adult whose gift and genius is vision. The person who felt voiceless can grow into the guide who speaks deep truths. The one who felt spiritually disconnected can become a bridge for others' reconnection. Or the one who carried a deep loneliness can become the one who helps to midwife belonging. There's a kind of poeticism to that, where the relationship between the wound and the gift is not just accidental, it's archetypal. As Carl Jung pointed out, the task is not to fix the wound, but to change our relationship to it. Because buried inside the wound is a blueprint of our emerging self. And it's here that there's that opportunity for reorientation. When we stop running, when we stop arguing with reality, when we unclench the fist of the mind and finally stop clinging to an expired version of ourselves. The beginnings of reorientation and re-emergence. Now, as I mentioned, in this exact season of darkness that I've been in, I haven't fully inhabited the reorientation. I'm still in the mud, I'm still in the unraveling. I'm not speaking from the resolution where everything makes sense. But in saying that, I have been here before at different times in slightly different contexts, and I've guided countless others over the past decade through this initiatory threshold. So even though I'm not yet fully reoriented at this stage, I am very familiar with the territory. I'm aware of many of the patterns that appear when a life is being reforged. I'm aware of the larger arc of transformation. The caterpillar turning to mush inside the cocoon. We know that's not a failure. We know that's not regression. It is indeed the very unglamorous, necessary decomposition of an identity that no longer fits. It's part of the metamorphoses of being reborn. And it's not something happening to us, but as the saying goes, it's something happening for us. So the reorientation emerges when we actually start telling the truth to ourselves, when we stop betraying and abandoning ourselves. It's in the way that we adjust our life just one small degree at a time. It's a turning towards authenticity, towards sincerity, exactly as we are. Sincera, without wax, as the old folk etymology goes, way back in the Renaissance era, where The marble sculptures and the honey were marked and sold as being sincera, without wax, signifying that they were genuine, pure, honest, transparent. Reorientation is honoring the quiet voice that says, no, we're not ignoring this anymore. It's in the moment that we stop pretending that something is tolerable when really it's not. It comes in those moments of clarity, the fragments of clarity that still disappear, but they linger long enough for us to catch a glimpse of something important, something more meaningful. The returning sense of what feels alive, of where our soul is guiding us, or new values whispering their way into our awareness. Perhaps just a sense of the person who we might be becoming, even if we can't fully articulate it yet. It's not necessarily a big fireworks extravaganza rebirth, but perhaps rather more so a gentle correction of our inner compass, where we begin reorienting our life around what feels right, not what's expected. We stop ignoring our soul just to have a sense of belonging, even though that doesn't really feel right. We allow meaning and purpose to be reconfigured over time. We take more seriously our desires and our needs. Courage gives way to renewed relationships and healthier boundaries. And we can soften into a deeper self-honesty where those harsh truths that may have once felt overwhelming become less so, and they actually become more magnetic. All of that sounds great, but it actually requires paying attention to what our darkness, our wounds, our crisis is actually showing us, listening to what it's asking of us. And we might not like what it has to say because they might be sobering directives. We may be asked to dismantle things we still love, to let go of roles that once felt fulfilling or purposeful, to admit that certain identities or relationships no longer hold the same weight, the same meaning, to reconceive what the entirety of our lives look like. And so it presents the following questions. How do we actually remain present with what's here? How do we listen to our daemon, our genius, that inner guiding force directing us back to truth? How do we deal with all the darkness? What do we actually do with it all? And I certainly don't have all the answers, but I can share some of the things that have greatly helped me. Well, firstly, resting where needed as a form of nurturing, nourishment, recuperating from any kind of soul fatigue, creating space, decluttering my life so something new can land, walking and being out in nature, so helping to regulate the nervous system, oneself in the natural world. And part of creating space is getting quiet and still to actually stay in conversation with what's present instead of burying everything in distractions. Creating can be helpful for me. And mainly I do that through writing and of course these videos, but the writing in particular helps me to transform a lot of this chaos into coherence, into something that might be useful or helpful. Keeping up with a list of essential tasks that maintain some movement and positive momentum so I don't completely fall into stagnation, and lifting weights and going to the gym is part of that for me, to maintain some sense of positive progression. I pray and ask for guidance. And honestly, I really could get better at asking other humans for support because I have a default pattern of withdrawal and silence because I feel so deeply and I'm aware of so much complexity on my path. I often don't want to burden others with the depths of what I'm navigating. So I have a tendency to keep that all to myself, but that's not a healthy thing to do. I am working on it and getting better at it. But then also finding ways to get out of my own mess and being kind to others and helping others where I have the capacity to do so. Because sometimes supporting others during my own darkness, oftentimes can actually help me to reconnect to my own light and can be a great source of strength and empowerment rather than depletion. The wounded healer, where service can actually be a part of salvation. If you're already familiar with me and my work, and even just through listening to this, you may get the sense that two of the deepest pathways, the ones that I've long been drawn to, that have really helped me in a big way to reconnect and remember my truth, have been the initiatory wilderness rites and then the sacred medicine path. These pillars have really helped to carry me through some of my deepest woundings and darker seasons. And while they're not for everyone, for some of us, they can certainly help in a big way when it comes to reforging a life of truth from the inside out, to reorienting us to heart, soul, and spirit, helping with the emergence, the re-emergence of our genius, our daemon, our inner guiding light of who it is that we're actually becoming. So there certainly is an appropriate place for these kind of ritual processes, and certainly so community, in the midst of collapse and transformation. And perhaps this is part of why, even inside my own descent, despite my own crisis of meaning and purpose and identity, I can still guide others in a good way because I'm very aware of the terrain. And in one sense, I've been grounded in these ways for such a long time. And despite the questioning of everything, they're still the pathways that I offer to others because I know that they're part of my gifts that I have to share. And because these pathways are just so profound and powerful in their potential to completely transform our lives. We do have a couple of programs happening in 2026 next year that may be of interest, but I'll speak about those upcoming gatherings at the end because for now, what I do want to say is if you are inside your own descent, collapse, crisis, dark season, disorientation, discombobulation, it's a good thing to try and remember this is a place for being remade, an opening, a threshold crossing. And sometimes it's not about rushing to climb out of the crisis, but just being with it, accepting the death of the old identity, honoring the pain and the grief that comes with it, rebuilding life from a deep sense of personal rightness rather than habituated patterns or expectation, and letting the crisis teach us how to walk forward with more truth, more depth, more sincerity, more heart, soul, spirit. So let me sound the horn for 2026 and say, may we all connect more intimately to our unique paths of truth and wisdom for ourselves, our families, our loved ones, our people. And if you are following me because you've been interested in my programs and gatherings and you're curious about exploring the shamanic wilderness arts, I want to end with this blunt truth and say the following. There's no guarantees that participating in sacred ceremony or initiatory passage rites will bear fruit upon our return. A huge part of that is in our ability to keep showing up and to keep the conversation alive, because we may have the insights, the revelations, the moments of connection, the greater vision for what it is that's possible, but not every seed becomes a tree. Not every tree reaches maturity or grows old enough to bear fruit. Some wither before their time. Some struggle. Some simply need more seasons. The fruit of these experiences depends less on what happens inside a ceremonial container and more on how we continue to show up afterwards in our determination, our character, our commitment, our listening, our devotion to heart and soul and spirit to keep showing up for ourselves. In the preparation of these experiences, yes, certainly so, but especially upon our return and in all the quiet and challenging days that follow, because the fruit typically doesn't grow through revelation alone, but through our continued intentional participation with life. That's what keeps the medicine flowing into our lives. So hopefully some of that is helpful if you've been navigating something similar, and if you are in that place of intentional deepening, I'll share our 2 initiatory threshold gatherings for 2026 because they may be of interest. Our Sweat Lodge and Sacred Ceremony, January 22nd to the 25th, 4 days of the shamanic healing arts for awakening and higher consciousness, opening the doors of perception and doing our deep healing work with the wisdom of the cactus in both a nighttime and a daytime ceremony, within a stunning setting of big granite boulders and fresh mountain stream. And then our autumn vision quest, the Wilderness Vigil, March 28th till April 4th. One of the most ancient and powerful initiatory passage rites that we still have access to in our day and age. 4 days and nights of fasting alone in nature, trading the comforts and familiarities of modern living for an intimate encounter with the wild. It's a time and a place and a space to call in a greater vision, a life reset, asking the big questions around meaning, direction, purpose, fulfillment, identity, processing grief, transitioning from one life stage to the next and honoring and acknowledging that, connecting with spirit and nature in profound ways. If you hear the call or feel a curiosity, I'll leave the link in the show notes. Send me an email, connect with me on social media at Caiyuda. Subscribe and drop a like or a comment if this resonated. You know the drill. Share the love if this has been helpful. But for now, I'll leave you with it. Thanks again for tuning in. Good tidings and warm winds your way. Until next time.